So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. It is the end of the day of the third day, second last day of the conference. We've had very rich discussions during the 3 days, but also probably also very tiring on all of us. So we really appreciate your finding some energy to join us this afternoon and to engage with this panel. My name is Andrea Rocca. I'm the Civic Space Policy Lead at the Secretariat of Transparency International. And we have a great panel here today to discuss, as you see, whose interest do we serve as civil society and the issue of foreign agent laws that are proliferating across the world. Now, why do a panel on civic space? We heard over these 3 days several discussions around the need to protect civil society activists, journalists investigating corruption, human rights defenders and those exposing corruption. But we need to broaden the discussion going from only protection in individual cases to the broader environment where we operate, because otherwise we'll fail. Without civic space, without a set of laws and regulation and an environment where civil society can operate freely and safely, the contribution of civil society to the anti-corruption cause can't materialize. And that is, of course, regardless of the sector on which we work, whether it is anti-corruption, human rights, or other issues. And we'll focus today on a specific aspect, and that is foreign agent laws. Why this? Because on one hand, they've been on the news for many years, especially since the passing in Russia of a foreign agent law in 2012, which has provided somehow the model for a number of other laws in other countries. But this phenomenon has accelerated, especially in the last year and a half or two. We have seen similar legislation being discussed in Georgia, and we will discuss about that today, but also announcements or plans around similar laws in Slovakia, in other countries within Europe, but also elsewhere. And already several years back, in fact, countries in Latin America have they started to copy the same model with laws in Nicaragua, in Peru, and elsewhere. And I think this time for debate is somehow lacking in anti-corruption fora. We need to discuss that more, because otherwise, again, we will fail in our mission to fight corruption. And this is true of this conference, it is true also of global anti-corruption intergovernmental fora, where equally there is potential to do much more important work around civic space and to facilitate and ensure that civil society can work freely, but this is at the moment often lacking. Now, we have a great lineup, and I'll introduce it just in the order with whom they are sitting next to me. So first, on my right is Tara Petrovic, Civic Space Research Officer at CIVICUS. She leads research on Europe and Central Asia for the CIVICUS Monitor, that I believe everyone knows is one of the foremost, the most well-known measurement of civic space across the world. We have next to Tara then Eka Gigauri, the Executive Director of Transparency International Georgia since 2010, members of the International Board of Transparency International, as well as the committee member of the Open Government Partnership. We have then Carlotta Besozzi, the Director of Civil Society Europe, which is a network of networks bringing together over 22 European networks of civil society organizations to facilitate and enabling dialogue between civil society and policymakers and strengthen the civil society sector. And we have then Nicholas Miller, who is the Senior Legal Advisor and Coordinator for Multilateral Engagement at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, or ICNL. And we have, last but not least, Janet Zhu, the Executive Director of ZIMCODD, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, which is an organization fighting for socioeconomic justice, a coalition established in 2000 to facilitate citizen involvement in making public policy more pro-people and pro-poor. So we'll have a discussion, and we'll have a round of questions and a conversation among the panel for half of the time that we have, but we want then to open it up to you and really have an engagement, a conversation with you. And Eka, I will start with you first of all. Now, Georgia, of course, has been in the news since last year when the foreign agent law was not just tabled but passed. It was eventually withdrawn thanks to your work and the mobilization of many other civil society organizations. It was, however, then we thought it was a success story, but it was then retabled this year, just a couple of months ago, interestingly with a different name, and we'll get to it later, but with exactly the same content. Can you tell us what is the situation at the moment and why these attempts by the government in a country that was in the path to European integration?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. You rightly mentioned that Georgia for the last several months was in the news. So because, again, our government has decided to initiate so-called foreign agents law. As you said, yes, last year we actually managed to fight back and change the intentions of the government, but this year they have slightly changed the title of the law, but their intentions apparently were not changed. So I just want to underline what is important to know about the so-called foreign agents law, right? So we now apparently have this long experience of advocating against this, and I can talk about our experience here. So the first one is, of course, we all should remember that it's not about the transparency. You know, the government will push, the ruling party will push the idea that it's about the transparency. We all should know about, like, you know, from where the money comes for particular groups in the country, and these groups are mostly the civic activists, the anti-corruption activists, and the independent media. But apparently it's not about the transparency at all, because exactly those groups do not have problems with transparency. They know that they are involved in a very sensitive issues. They are investigating corruption. They are identifying the particular officials in the government who are involved in the corruption, and that's why they try to be very transparent. So the transparency is their strength. That's why these groups do not have any problems with the transparency. The second very important issue is that it's about the stigmatization of particular groups, and especially these are, again, those who are fighting for the transparency in the government, anti-corruption activists, the independent media, the investigative journalists, and so on. So this is very, very important to mention. So what the government's intention is to make sure that the public, in public's eyes, they are undermined and their reputation is undermined. So this is very important to know. Very often, another, I would say, observation is that very often the governments would use as arguments the laws that have been adopted in other countries. For instance, this is well known that the governments are using FARA, right? So saying that the same kind of law exists in other countries, like, you know, the US, and if the US or the EU is criticizing the actions of the government, it's not correct because these governments have also the same kinds of laws. And this is very important to know. Another observation that we have apparently is that this process against those groups does not start overnight. Right? So the governments and the ruling parties, they try to start the campaign when they are undermining particular groups and even individuals from the civil society and from the media, like really coordinating the smear campaigns against these people, so for the public to have some identified individuals who are problematic in this, for the society. And I mean, for instance, in Georgia, I was amongst them. So in other countries, I'm sure there are some others. So, and again, these are most probably anti-corruption activists and the investigative journalists. So this is very important to know. What they say about these people is that that these people hate their country, that they are not patriots of their country, that they act in the interest of the foreign governments, that they hate everything national, everything, like, you know, the culture, even the culture, like, you know, they really want to undermine the state interest. They are spies. And they really do everything against their own people and their own homelands. So, and with this, the governments try to win the hearts and minds of people who are less informed and maybe less educated. And sometimes these people believe in what the propaganda is saying. So this is why it's very difficult then for those civic groups to resist to the propaganda of the government, which continues for months, for even years. And yes, emotionally, it is also very hard for the civil society organizations and for the journalists, because we identify ourselves as patriots of our country, right? So, and suddenly someone is calling you spy, and you put yourself in the self-defense situation, saying that no, in fact, we are serving our country and people, and this is what we do, and we never promote what we are doing, because we are not the politicians. We are here just to help people, which is, by the way, big mistake, because then when it starts all this campaign against you, you have to show that no, apparently there were thousands of people that you were helping during the years. So yes, so I think in case of Georgia, we did something in a different way. So we apparently tried not to build on the campaign and propaganda of the government, although, as you said, so we were not successful this year, and the government has adopted the law. But our observation and our experience is that we should not put the groups, like the civic groups, should not put themselves in the self-defense situation. This is very important. Also, never talk about and never call this law the foreign agents law or the agents law. For instance, in Georgia, we call it Russian law because the same type of law was adopted in Russia, and it's so understandable for the local public. What does it mean for the country to adopt the Russian law? So, also what is important to know, that your audience should not be only the donors community. Very often these groups would approach the donors community saying that you should help us. No, you have to work with the public. You have to mobilize the public, and you have explained to the public how important it is to have the civil society and like the independent media and so on. So we were extremely successful in this, and we actually were very good in strategic communication. So we really try to use different tools in order to persuade public that that is whatever is happening is bad and it's not good for the country. So I can continue talking about this, but just to conclude again. So looking at the title of our panel. what I want to say is that it's very important to resist, and we are doing this in Georgia. We have decided not to comply with this law, and we understand that in the several months' time. So the defense line, I would say, will be in the offices of particular organizations, including TI Georgia, because we will be in top 5, I would say, or even number 1, who will be targeted by the government in September, right before the elections. And this is very important to mention, that we are targeted because we are going to monitor the elections in October, and also because of our investigative reports on corruption. Second thing is that of course, like, you know, it will impact our activities, because what we expect is that our accounts will be freezed and our assets will be freezed, and we will not have financial resources to operate, although many people are approaching us now, asking us to tell them what they can do for us and for the country. Not only for us, but for the country. So, and the third thing is that, yes, so it's still positive, I would say. It's still positive that, that now at the end of the day, the Georgian public has learned how important it is to have the civil society in the country. So before, they did not have knowledge what exactly civil society does. You know, and now they apparently, they see so many small and big groups who are working with the public, who are serving the public, and who are, like, you know, doing everything for this country to become better. And I think that it's the same in other countries as well. So that's why I would say that I look at the things from
this is fantastic angle. Because the aim clearly of foreign agent laws is to undermine the legitimacy of the organization and understanding that organizations have in society, but in this case in Georgia has created the opposite effect. So it's been counterproductive somehow for the government, given what you said. I also particularly liked your strategy when you mentioned that you have, in a way, reclaimed the narrative and not played into the rhetoric and calling it foreign agent law, but in fact refusing to use this label and calling it the Russian law. And we'll come back later on the issue of narratives and the type of rhetoric. Well, I'd like to turn to you, Nicholas. Now, this is Georgia, but of course, the laws, similar laws have been adopted in a number of countries. I mentioned a few before, but in the same region, also, of course, in Kyrgyzstan, but then in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere. Are they all the same? Or they are different? And also picking on another point that Eka mentioned, the justification often used is, well, the US as the FARA Act is the same. Is that indeed the same?
Yeah, Andrea, thank you for those questions. First, also, thank you for letting me be here. I think I am not an anti-corruption person. So I actually feel really privileged to be here with this crowd, because we are seeing in these foreign agents laws and in so many ways an intersection between closing of civic space and the important work that is done by anti-corruption activists. This particular example that we've just heard of in Georgia, unfortunately, is the end of a long process of foreign agents laws that are rising up just like mushrooms after rain. So I'm going to break the third wall a little bit here and actually ask those of you in the audience, if you in your country have a foreign agents law either enacted or pending, raise your hand for me. Yeah, okay, so quite a few. Now, what I'm going to try to give you a little bit in this answer is a sense of where these are, how we got here now, and then how we understand the variance in these laws, because in understanding how they vary, there are a lot of lessons for us to use in advocating against them and in rebutting some of the arguments that we hear, like, oh, we're just doing what those other countries have done. So first, what is a foreign agents law or a foreign influence law? The way we at ICNL understand this, really basically, is that it is a law that creates an obligation to register as a result of receiving foreign funding or operating, air quotes here, on the behalf of a foreign actor. So obviously on the behalf of is a pretty tricky proposition. We'll talk a little bit about that. But you'll hear, oh, the US has one. And the US does have one. It has something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That law dates to 1938. Think a little bit and you'll realize what was happening in the world in 1938. That law was passed in the US as a way to combat Nazi propaganda in the US. And it was originally used as an anti-propaganda law quite extensively. But then it mostly went into a sort of semi-hibernation. And you'll also know about the United States that we have a pretty large civil society sector. Only a very, very small percentage. I mean, you could count the number of civil society organizations that have registered under the Foreign Agents Act, FARA. It actually has mostly been used against lobbyists, so quite distinguishable. But since the 1938 law, we didn't see another one passed in the world until Russia in 2012. And that's interesting. That's a long hiatus. But Russia passed that law in 2012, and within 2 years, we saw foreign agents proposals in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan. Now, the Kyrgyz one in 2014 was not adopted, it was proposed. And the Ukrainian law adopted in 2014 was later repealed. But that started the ball rolling downhill. And in 2016, we had a proposal in Slovakia. Also, you'll note the geopolitical connection there. And then in 2016 as well, Kazakhstan. And then in 2016, Israel, which might seem strange, but Israel's been widely accused of using that law selectively against Palestinian groups. Then 2017, Hungary. So again, you're seeing kind of a population with some commonalities here. The narrative gets more complicated. In 2018, Australia adopted a law on foreign agents. And then in 2020, Canada had a proposal. Canada still has a pending proposal. It's now in its third iteration. Then in 2021, Nicaragua and El Salvador. Then in 2022, Russia decided its law was not draconian enough, so it passed a stronger one that superseded the previous one. And then 2023, the UK adopted one. So you see, it's getting faster, and it's getting more diverse. And so where are we now? Right now, as we sit in this room, laws to regulate foreign influence are pending in Bulgaria, Canada, El Salvador, recently withdrawn, may come back, the EU, which we'll hear more about, France, Abkhazia, Myanmar. They have a committee that's been tasked with drafting one. The Republika Srpska had one that they just withdrew. That may come back as well. And Slovakia. So acceleration is the takeaway. Diversity is also the takeaway. So how do we understand that diversity? Okay, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a framework for thinking how these laws vary. First, ask, who does this law actually apply to? This is key, because one thing you'll quickly discover is that in countries where they are intending to close down civil society and opposition voice, almost always these laws only regulate nonprofits. In countries where they aren't, these laws are almost always universally applicable. Private individuals, corporations, political parties, anyone. That's the first distinction, and it's a telltale sign of intent. The second, the nature of the relationship required for the law to apply. Is it just receiving funding? Does that trigger the law? In a lot of countries it is. And again, if that's the threshold, you have a warning sign that this is intended to be broad and not narrowly tailored to actual legitimate interests. You can see in other places, though, where it's not based on the receipt of funding, but it's based on the type of activity. And that's probably a better way to go, but there's still a lot of variance, and you have to look deeper. Which foreigners? You might not think about that, but it actually matters. In the narrowly tailored laws, it's usually only the government, a political party, or an agent of the government. But in the usually the more balanced laws, it actually, backwards. In the more draconian laws, it often is any foreigner. And in fact, in the US, the law is written as any foreign actor that donates money or for whom you operate on behalf of. But in the narrower narrower laws more recently adopted, like Australia and the UK, it's more specific. And what kind of activities are covered? This one's interesting too. So in the narrower laws, it tends to say political decision-making processes. If you try to influence those, for example, if you go and talk to parliamentarians or you propose something to a political party, that might be a covered activity. But in the broader laws, they sometimes talk about communications activities. So just providing information to the public can be a qualifying activity. And that often is very hard to justify under the international law requirements of narrowly tailored, legitimate, specific purpose. So again, a red flag. If it's not for specific and articulated purposes, it's likely to fall afoul of international law. The requirements. So what do you have to do? Do you just join a registry? Is that public? What information do you have to provide? Is it just the name of the organization, or are you actually giving your passport number, as in many countries? And then, do you have to label your information that you put out? Are you actually prevented if you register from undertaking certain types of activities? These vary widely as well. And lastly, what are the penalties? Because this tells you a lot as well. So in places where they actually are not trying to close down civil society, the penalties usually are minor, administrative, scaled. In places where their intent is otherwise, and obviously more malign, the penalty usually starts at draconian fines, penalties for organizations and individuals, and can include closing the organization, even jail time. So what do we take from all this? I've given you a lot of information. The conclusion that I'd like for you to take away from this is, if you raised your hand, you already know you need to be dealing with this. If you didn't raise your hand, note that the trend is for these to proliferate. So it's still worth your while to understand what these could do and what forms they take. Second, they're not all the same. So you need to really look at them carefully and dig down to understand how best to oppose them, where they exceed international law, what the damage they will do will be. And also, and most importantly, we'll talk about this more later, these laws often are vulnerable to the argument that they don't actually solve the problem they're intended to solve, because usually the problem is fictional, or almost always the problem is already addressed by other existing laws. So when you start to unpick them, you can find those arguments and use them more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. A lot of elements there, but almost a blueprint for assessing these laws and whether they have a legitimate aim and or they are just purely fictional and with a clear intent to stigmatize civil society. Now, we're going to step back a little bit now, and Tara, I will turn to you. Eka mentioned how the passing of the Russian law in Georgia was in fact preceded by a long campaign of delegitimization and smear campaigns against civil society activists. And this is where it all starts. In many other countries around the world, even if the list is that long, as Nicholas mentioned, but there are many, many more countries where this type of rhetoric is used against civil society, being unpatriotic, being against the interest of the nation, if not explicitly foreign agents, or even against traditional values. So there are a number of epithets and labeling that are used. What are you seeing around the world, and how there is really, even in the absence of a law, how does that rhetoric affect civil society?
Thank you for this question. I really am happy that before we got to this segment of mine that I had the opportunity to hear from Eka, because so much of what she's saying reflects what we're seeing around the world and what we're seeing in, I think Nick called it a certain population. There is a prevalence of this very specific type of rhetoric that you've mentioned, especially in countries, whether we want to call them post-communist, whether we want to call them Eastern Europe and Central Asia and so on. But the phenomenon of foreign agent laws, as we heard, is global. So I would like to first contextualize what we're seeing in terms of the conditions civil society exists in globally in this moment, so that we can understand why these types of laws, sometimes even regardless of their intent, can be so easily misused against civil society, and how. So as Andrea mentioned in the introduction, the organization I represent is the CIVICUS Monitor. What we do is we track the state of civic space, so the fundamental freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly around the world in 198 countries and territories. I won't bore you with our methodology, but what we do is we, with the help of over 20 research partners, to give as concrete and empirical as possible numbers and figures to quantify the existence of civic space. And what we're seeing compared to the recent past, we began monitoring in 2018, is that right now, almost a third of the world's population, so 2.4 billion people around the world, live in countries where civic space is completely closed. So they live in countries where anybody expressing a dissenting opinion can be killed, injured, or imprisoned with complete impunity. In contrast, only around 2% of the global population live in countries where civic space is open, which is half as much as when we began monitoring 5 years ago. So it was almost 4%, now it's down to 2%. And this backsliding in civic space is in large part attributable to backsliding specifically in Europe and Central Asia, and even in what we call established or mature democracies. So we have an empirical basis to say that the space for civil society to in any way organize, to in any way affect change has shrunk and is consistently shrinking. And what we're seeing is that in our monitoring, where we track violations of civic space and attacks on civil society, that the most common tactic employed by both state and non-state actors wishing to stifle criticism is intimidation. And intimidation comes in many forms, but it's often connected to another thing we monitor, which is something we call public vilification. And we recorded over 80 instances of public vilification and targeting and smear campaigns against civil society actors and journalists in 2023 alone. And going through those individual examples, what we can see is that critics who are often civil society organizations working on certain topics. So for example, particularly targeted are CSOs working on performing a watchdog function, so anti-corruption CSOs, CSOs working on democracy and human rights more broadly, environmental activists, CSOs working with refugees and migrants, CSOs working on LGBTQI rights, and so on. And we see them, when we see them targeted, when we see them smeared, we see them referred to as so either foreign agents or enemies or spies. The common narrative is to take the criticism that these civil society actors or journalists direct at the government as part of their necessary watchdog role, and sort of repackage and repurpose it as an attack on the state itself, as, like Eka said, as motivated by hatred of the country and a wish to see it be discredited. I think we mentioned that these laws are proliferating very rapidly. We know how many of them are pending in this moment. But one thing I found particularly interesting is that in the same week, it was first announced that the law would be reintroduced in Georgia, so only a couple of days apart. Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina announced they were moving forward with their law that had previously been shelved in September. Kyrgyzstan's president signed their foreign agent law into law. These were only genuinely a day or two apart, these events. And what's also symptomatic of something Eka mentioned, and I think it's a very common narrative deployed against CSOs, particularly in Eastern Europe and the post-communist space, is that these laws are part of a broader culture war, so to speak, because so in each of these countries, both in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, and Republika Srpska, the entity within Bosnia and Herzegovina, immediately surrounding those laws, other proposals were tabled dealing with that also resemble, might be coincidentally, repressive legislation found in Russia that is directed at stopping LGBTQ propaganda. And that is directed against marginalized groups under a common rhetoric of, so we heard defending national values, but more so against stopping the spread of some type of propaganda, which comes from the collective sort of liberal West. And this is something we see a lot. The narrative that human rights as such and as propagated by NGOs with their important societal role are imposed from outside on these countries, and that hostile powers, so to speak, who fund these groups are using them as a pretext to undermine the sovereignty, tradition, and national values of these countries. So we see that narrative very, very commonly deployed against NGOs, contributing to. So this narrative is propagated by politicians, is propagated by authorities, is repeated by pro-government media, and we see them. We see it then have an effect on the public image of NGOs in society, and that's. I mean, we can. I can expand on this more after, but I think it contributes to a vicious cycle where NGOs, often those working on the most important and most sensitive topics, are attacked and smeared by the government. Government funding is inaccessible to them due to the fact that they are publicly targeted and presented as sort of spies, traitors, enemies, and subversives. This contributes to their negative public image, which prevents them from doing community fundraising at a large scale. making them more reliant on foreign funding, which is then used to smear them.
Thank you. So indeed, connected is not one single strategy of targeting the image, but then is repercussions on a number of other areas that in turn affect and weaken, or that is the intention at least, civil society. We are going to explore this a bit more with Janet. Now, we talked a lot about rhetoric. We talked about the laws already. We talked about the rhetoric that becomes before the laws. And does that play a role as well in Zimbabwe? There are some very concerning developments recently with the PVO bill being pending, a new regulation on civil society. As that type of rhetoric and stigmatization of civil society has been sold out to foreign powers and not being patriotic enough plays a role, and what is the current situation with the bill?
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that question, and for my fellow panelists. I think they have explained, like you have said, how it's playing out and how it is a global phenomenon. But as Nicholas was actually talking, I was thinking this is not so recent for Zimbabwe. In the early 2000s, in the previous administration under the late former president Robert Mugabe, we had what was called the NGO bill. So if you look at it from the early 2000s, there was that attempt to interfere with the civil society work through the NGO bill. And it was actually passed by parliament, and only at the presidential assent that then the late president did not sign, so it fell off back then. We have then seen probably two laws coming into once again through the legislative processes, and one is the Criminal Codification Amendment Act, or the Patriotic Act as it became in 2023. This is definitely a foreign agent law. It restricts and controls how the citizens and civil society engage outside or with foreigners or foreign agencies, to put it that way. So that actually became law in the 9th Parliament. Currently, there is the private voluntary organization bill, which is about the registration, which defines the work, the scope of work, composition of boards, and all that. And there are fears and concerns from civil society in terms of interference by government and civil society work due to the sweeping powers and discretions that are given to the minister responsible. This is also caused by the fact that there's so many gray areas in terms of what constitutes civil society work or in NGOs work, whether it's political, whether it's partisan, whether it's still civic. And we're always saying that if, for example, in social and economic justice work, you're asking about who gets what, when, and how. And the issue of interpretation may really limit the work and cause that, that kind of interference. And I think my colleagues have spoken to the issue of intimidation and victimization, which is a potential if the laws were to be used in that regard. And civil society organizations have also raised the issue of the fear of increased surveillance of the work of civil society organizations. And I was going to point to why, as well, these bills or this act. In 2019, Zimbabwe was put under the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. And that means there were concerns when it comes to some weak measures that were identified, and that it was going to be on more scrutiny in terms of terrorist financing and anti-money laundering, and the government had to put in place mechanisms. And one of the identified mechanisms was a law to regulate civil society in Zimbabwe. So ostensibly, that is the reason. But they are all then these fears in terms of the interference because of the very strict requirements, like Nicholas has said, the issues of scope of work, penalties that includes jail, and very hefty penalties, even in terms of dollars and cents, if you were to be violating the laws. And this definitely plays into the rhetoric then that other colleagues have pointed out to. And I would say this issue raises the power of labels, especially in a context where you're playing a watchdog role. You want to be independent, you want to be objective, you want to build civic agency, you want to work with institutions, even of government in terms of strengthening them for their work. So if you have a label that you're doing partisan work or regime change agent, something like that, it becomes very difficult to engage with citizens and to associate, because everyone becomes then worried and probably afraid to engage with you. Institutions that you believe could play the role are also not comfortable to engage and to work with you because they may be identified as working with the enemy of the state and all that. So the power of labels is key then in the work, and it kind of impacts on programs. But it also plays out in terms of funding. I've realized that in Zimbabwe as well, the funders and the donors, they don't want, because they also, it's diplomatic relationships. So if they are engaging or funding your work, they risk as well being labeled as influencing the work. So it kind of impacts as well on the issue of funding and donor relationships, which is a bit scary if we look at it from that perspective and the work of civil society organizations in my country. So I would say it is there, but it is a global phenomenon, as we have said, and it's expanding. And probably, just as I conclude, we'll deal with other issues in terms of how we've engaged with our government and with institutions so that we are where we are in terms of the laws that haven't been passed, probably still pending. It took some engagements. But I wanted to say that, and Nicholas, I would refer as well to your point about the expansion in different jurisdictions, the EU, Canada, and it has become one of the excuses as well. So all these countries and jurisdictions can't be on that moral high ground where they say democratize, open civic space, because then our governments will be like, but it's happening everywhere. The EU itself is passing these laws. Absolutely. Canada, Australia, all this. So there is a set example that is also justifying why we have to have these laws. Thanks. But the danger is this now, the victimization and interference with the work, the watchdog work, holding accountable, working with institutions that would actually benefit from the technical assistance, from the funding and all this. Yeah. That's a great segue to a question to Carlotta. But first, I just want to draw attention, given where we are in the IACC and the audience, how Zimbabwe is also one of those examples where FATF standards have been misused and the recommendation has been taken as an opportunity by the government to just target civil society instead of following the risk-based approach, which is what is mandated by FATF, and doing an assessment of what particular sectors within civil society may be more at risk. Now, Carlotta, there's been mentioning of what is happening in Europe, and of course it's already for a few months, or since actually longer than that, the EU has announced its plan for the so-called defense of democracy package, purportedly trying to address the issue of malign foreign interference in democratic processes and policy making. But there has been also a lot of criticism by civil society, some thinking that it is in fact a foreign agent law in disguise.
Yes, definitely. In fact, when we were talking, Nicholas, you were talking about intent and how a law shapes itself. There we have the problem that we have a proposal on the table, which was presented end of last year. Although the process was quite long, which doesn't have actually as an intent to stigmatize or jeopardize in itself civil society. The main aim is really to address foreign interference. But at the same time, this legislation, well, first of all, it's a question, is it the right instrument at the right moment? Because it was the context of election, and you have to know that the EU has been discussing the issue of regulating funding to political parties and was not able to reach a consensus on that. So the president of the commission comes with this idea and says, I have to do something for the election, and so maybe I can do this kind of legislation that, as Nicholas was saying, we are talking about, in this case, the transparency of interest representation, which is carried out on behalf of third countries. So we have that element. So the problem there is already when there were discussions in the law within the European Commission, there were big divergences as well, and when we saw that it was upcoming, so not only from civil society, because what is the situation? There has been a law in Hungary on which the European Commission has done an infringement procedures that went up to the European Court of Justice, and there has been a ruling in 2020 which led to the repealing the law, and it clearly, actually, they are in this judgment. We can see that you cannot, that you have clearly limits to regulating this issue of foreign funding, and that you have to respect the freedom of association, and also you need to have a legitimate aim. So you have this context. You have the context that was explained before about laws that are coming up in Georgia and in other countries in which the EU has been very vocal against. And now it finds itself a bit at odds with that. The legislation, of course, covers very different kinds of entities, but it has been not very well drafted, and it's also the problem. First of all, this transparency of interest representation is really focused on foreign funding, which is a problem. It's not overall transparency of representation. And you create a register when you actually bring to the forefront only representation, but also advocacy activities, because the definitions are extremely vague, which are done with foreign funding. And there again, not so clear. It is only third countries, governments. There is also these entities which are connected to the government, and their definitions are very vague. And no thresholds, no financial thresholds. So you can have 100 euros an activity, an interest representation activity, which is financed with a very limited sum, but still you have to register. A lot of very heavy requirements. You get a registration number as a result, and this registration number, you don't have necessarily to flag it everywhere, but whenever you meet even a very local mayor for an issue that is not even related to your activity, you have to give him or her that number. And the problem is, of course, that this can have a chilling effect and limitation on what are general activities of civil dialogue or of work that is done also in terms of, for example, anti-corruption, addressing democratic deficits. Another big problem is that the impact outside the EU, so organizations outside the EU, and there we are talking about civil society organizations, potentially independent media, and also there are also issues for academia, is if they engage, for example, with the EU or member states on issues, for example, of democracy or things, or issues like that, and they have some kind of third country funding, they will have to register. They will have to register, and they need a legal representative as well, so very burdensome. Secondly, it's also the issue that the EU and member states also carry some of these kinds of activities themselves, and they also do it in order to promote democracy, anti-corruption, and so on. And they also use third entities. An example is, for example, the European Endowment for Democracy, because it's risky in some countries to directly fund and also to protect the organization they do that. So what is the future of these initiatives? That's what we are also asking ourselves. And of course, the ability, as I was saying, to criticize this law. So for this reason, for all these reasons, and also the definition that I was mentioning, and the risk of confusion between what are legitimate actions in terms of advocacy, civil dialogue, and what is really lobbying and paid for, which is totally unclear in the directive, we are extremely concerned.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of the time, so I'm gonna ask you to speak for literally 30 seconds to 60 max for a quick second round, just to offer some food for thought then for the discussion, because we want to talk also, we talked a lot about the problem, and that is really helpful to understand what we're talking about, but we want to also discuss what can we do? Yeah. What are the solutions there? So I stay with you, Carlotta, and given all these issues or with the current draft of the EU Defence and Democracy Package, what is your proposal? Can it be improved? Should it just be scrapped? Is there an alternative way of achieving its aim? In a quick snapshot.
Yes, very difficult to improve. Also with a big risk in the European Parliament to further expand it and include criminalization and things like that. So certainly the alternative we are pushing for is rather to have a general transparency register, but we would not include this foreign funding dimension, and would be also completely changed with much lighter requirements as well. But it would be difficult to amend it as it is, certainly.
Thank you. And Eka, what kind of strategies are you using, both domestically, but also what do you think others should do? How can actors outside, if there is anything that they can do, what would you like to see happen?
First of all, of course, I should say that, yes, we are talking here about the law, but for the general public in Georgia, it's not about the law anymore. It's about where the country is going. It's about the quality of democracy. It's about who is which countries are the enemies for our government. So in our case, it's the EU, US, Canada, and all these developed countries who are investing in democracy, and not China, Russia, Iran, and other such countries, right? So this is what we are talking about, and it's about the decision of the government to distance Georgia from the European Union. And as you know, we were expecting to start the negotiations with the EU on the membership already. So apparently we are losing this. We are extremely lucky, and this is very good for other countries as well, that we have the assessment of ODIHR, of this piece of legislation, which is very important, I should say. We have the assessment of the Venice Commission as well, and we are going to apply to the European Court on Human Rights and even request the interim measures there. We'll see how we'll proceed with this, but it is very important to have such kind of example and such assessments for other countries as well. So what we expect from the outside world is that first, they all should acknowledge that this is a problem. You know, still, even in case of Georgia, we had the conversations with some donors whether there might be some additional mechanisms introduced in order to increase the transparency of the NGOs in Georgia. So again, they thought that, you know, it's about the transparency, and we had to explain that it's not. Now apparently everyone knows, but from the beginning it was a little bit difficult, and you know, it took time and energy from our side. Another thing is also what can be done from the US, from the EU, what kind of active measures and actions can be implemented to stop our governments, including the targeting sanctions. Because this is like, you know, this is what these governmental officials care about. They act like the Russian officials as well. They would love to have their families, or for their families to enjoy life in the US and the EU, to, like, you know, for their children to study in these European countries. This is what they want for their families, but not apparently for the citizens of Georgia. So that's why I think that it is very important for them to take the strict decisions right from the beginning, and not when it's too late. Because when it's too late, there will be no one on the ground who might resist to the actions of the government.
And that's an absolutely essential point, intervening before. But I also, just picking on your reference to sanctions, I think this is a very interesting development in the civic space arena as well, because sanctions, there are human rights sanctions instruments, the anti-corruption sanction instruments, but they have never been used before in relation to situation of civic space. I think the sanctioning by the US under the visa sanction scheme of the parliamentarians in Georgia for passing the foreign agent law is the first time. It happened with the Duma in Russia, but it was about the invasion of Ukraine, not the law related to civic space. So quite interesting development. Nicholas, sticking to the international level, you are responsible for ICNL engagement in multilateral fora and with governments. What kind of action would you like to be seen, to see happening to support organizations, civil society in countries where similar laws have been passed?
Okay, let me take your...
Again, 1 minute to you as well.
Okay, am I on? Yeah. First, across all the actions, one really important point: engage, coordinate, consult with civil society in the country affected. Without that, nothing else is going to work. Second, support the civil society who are coming under pressure, and that includes supporting those who experience these laws and have to relocate abroad because of them.
Yep.
Third, engage in bilateral advocacy, government to government and group of government to government. We've just heard about this El Salvador law potentially being shelved. I won't say exactly why, but the sense we get is that one important government said, if you pass it, we will discontinue a very popular assistance program and the government took that seriously. Governments have leverage, they need to use it. Fourth, be cognizant of the effect of international norms on these dialogues. You mentioned FATF. We heard about FATF in other contexts. The norms can work both ways. There are good norms on access to resources, and governments need to underline and support those. There are bad enabling norms, or norms that are used as pretext, like FATF, and governments need to draw the line where that's misused. Lastly, use multilateral mechanisms. You mentioned ODIHR, you mentioned the Venice Commission, good examples. You also mentioned the Hungary law, which was withdrawn. That was a result of a court case within the European system. Excellent example. There are more. Look for those legal levers. Court cases, international opinions, UN special rapporteurs. These are also important tools. Governments should make more use, and multilateral mechanisms should use them proactively.
Thanks, Nicholas. And Janet, the risk sometimes in countries is to use the international system is especially if it is other governments, it plays into the rhetoric of being against the nation. What kind of strategies, again, in a quick minute, have you explored, in particular the regional or sub-regional level?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea, for that. I think outside support is very important, probably as also outlined by Nicholas, but it can play into the rhetoric as well. I think I hear of the sanctions, we have gone through all that, but nothing really moved in that direction. But two things in our engagements at the national level, but also at the sub-regional level, that when it comes to FATF, as an example, in terms of why we're putting these laws into place, one is that we were saying, what mischief are we trying to cure? Because in the NGO sector, we haven't seen any civic leader prosecuted or implicated in money laundering, or any NGO closing for that reason. So laws are put in place to close the mischief that would have been seen. Two, we were saying that we have sufficient laws to cover for that and institutional frameworks for that. We have the Financial Intelligence Unit, we have got the RBZ Act, we have the Foreign Exchange, so many laws, various laws that could actually deal with this issue. So, one, I want to talk about the 2000 NGO bill. It only could not pass because of civil society advocacy work and engagements, which included working with the local clergyman, a well-known bishop within the Catholic, was well respected by the late president then, Father Mukonori, whom I'm actually told went to a funeral and said, there's a bill that's coming for your assent. If you assent to that bill, your image, you're going to be this dictator with closed space, and he did not sign. It took a local initiative and engagement, and it went through. The second one is the use of multilateral or multi-stakeholder platforms, which is what we have used for the PVO bill. We have what is called the high-level debt arrears clearance platform in Zimbabwe that was launched by the president in December 2022, and it's facilitated by former president of Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano, and the AFDB president, Adesina. And there are three pins. One of them is governance reforms, which the government has actually done the matrix in terms of the reforms in the governance. And the civil society sitting in that space, we raised this issue of laws, of the foreign agent laws, particularly the Patriotic Act or bill, and also the PVO. We ended up going to the extent of meeting with the president at State Houses, civil society organizations, with our analysis paper from the impact on civic space, on the economy itself, on the social security, just as an example that you're giving, that if you do this, look, our health, our education is dependent on donor funds, and they may withdraw all this. We went to State House and we engaged with the president in the 9th Parliament on these issues, and it ended up the president sending it back to Parliament in the 9th Parliament. Of course, unfortunately, it has come back in the 10th Parliament, but the engagement has continued as well. Just about 2 weeks ago, civil society leaders were called to come and meet with the Minister of Justice and present their case. So that's a platform that we have used.
Thank you.
Used at the multilateral but sub-regional level, but also an internal process that we're doing on our own to also dialogue nationally and talk about this.
Thank you. So you use unusual allies. No, I like the example of clergymen. I think at our level of international supporters of local organizations is not necessarily something that we are able or even think about. We think along more traditional lines. And equally though, the sub-regional process, it's about that, but you're bringing their issues that are clearly around civic space and laws and civil society. Tara, just again, one quick minute to you. You covered the issue of narratives, no, and the images in society. One good example of, strategy that you've seen used to try and alter the narrative before we get to the point of having bad laws being passed?
I think so. We've talked about how these narratives are weaponized against civil society, how we've now also seen that sometimes using the most important leverage you have in these situations, which is international pressure, can only feed into those narratives and then will not contribute to improving the sector's public image. So an interesting thing, given how all of these laws, the examples I've given, all came in at the exact same time. They were all in the news, both globally and locally, completely concurrently. And we've seen mass public mobilization in Georgia, but this mobilization has not happened, for example, in Bosnia or in Kyrgyzstan, while even though Georgia was number one, the number one news story at the time, and looking for no successes but strategies, speaking to activists and trying to figure out how they're trying to address the foreign agent narrative, either in their ongoing work or in response to these things. Two main things. Two main strategies can be identified, because in a situation where NGOs are smeared and vilified, the issue of access to resources, even though it's a fundamental part of freedom of association, it's not going to bring people into the streets. But so out of these two, one is to frame it as a broader issue of human rights, but specifically free speech and criticism, to expose the underlying intent behind the law, which is to silence critics, and then inspire in the audience a real sense that what if it's NGOs today, it could be you tomorrow, on this hunt for internal enemies and spies. The second one, which is which Eka already presented wonderfully, is to highlight the role played by NGOs in society in ways that are often invisible, because so often the most visible NGOs are those working on. So often NGOs are most visible in media when they are being subjected to smear campaigns instead of showing the results of their work.
Thank you. And apologies for rushing you through the second round, but we wanted to have some of these strategies, and already see several hands up. So please, over there, and then the gentleman here, and the gentleman over there. We take 4 questions. What do you have? We have 20 minutes, so we do 2 rounds. We take then 4 questions, and then hopefully a second one. Please.
I'm Grzegorz Makowski, Poland Stefan Batory Foundation and Warsaw School of Economics. And thank you for this wonderful panel discussion. I have a question, maybe reflection, and I'm very happy that almost all of you spoke a lot about narrative and how these laws are being presented to the public by the decision makers. And thank you, Nicholas, for characterizing the US law. And this US example, at least this is my experience, is still very strong. I mean, we can call these laws Russian laws or any other bad laws, but still the US serves as a benchmark. And we had experience also in Poland. Fortunately, the previous government didn't manage to pass this law, but we were very close. Now we have what Carlota said, I mean, draft law of the European directive, which might be passed. And I don't know, Carlota, if you agree, but even at the European level, this US example served as a strong example still. So this is very much about how it is presented, and this is very much how important is the US example. And you can speak about how important are civil society, human rights, and how much it shrinks the civil space, but the US have this law. And it doesn't matter how far is it from this example. So my question would be, I mean, do you think that US administration could engage a little bit more in education about what is this US law, forgotten in the US, but so lively, let's say, used in other countries. Is there any possibility? Because I think if we could engage a little bit more in conversation between governments, not only between us, civil society, and governments, or among us in the society, it doesn't help too much. But if the US government and governments could talk about a little bit more about this, maybe this could be a way out.
Thank you. So should the US government withdraw the FARA Act? Second person was over there.
Yeah.
I ask you, please, to be concise in your questions, so that we have time for 2 rounds and panel responses. Please.
Absolutely. My name is Mikhail Boyadjev. I'm from Bulgaria. I work for Basel Institute on Governments. I just wanted to clarify a little bit that there is no pending legislation on foreign agents in Bulgaria. There is a concept on regulating lobbying activities. As Nicola mentioned, there is a difference in this regard. And based on this, I would like to ask the panelists, what is the distinction, just to educate the people, between the lobbying activities and advocacy, between what is relevant to the NGOs and what is relevant to the making transparent decision-making process, because it's equally relevant for me. So we have to make clear regulations about transparency in decision-making process and clear regulations about anti-corruption, because flow of illicit funding in the policy making is also an issue. It's not about only the foreign agents, it's about the local oligarchs, particularly in society with the weak rule of law. So I want to mention, and this is my comment, general, just to mention about Bulgaria, just to make clear, but how you interpret the OECD recommendation about lobbying activities, because there are international standards of protecting, from one hand, the civil society, and from the other hand, protecting the societies from illicit flow in the decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman behind?
Good evening. This is Apollinaire from Transparency International Rwanda. It's a great pleasure to see the panelists, especially Eka, my friend. I think it's a trend. It's a trend we are struggling as well in Rwanda with these reforms on civil society laws. I followed the contribution from the colleague from Zimbabwe, and it's really copy-paste. We are, for example, in Rwanda, the law, when it was, when it passed from the cabinet, it's when we were informed about that law, which is restricting totally the civic space. Especially, there are some provisions which are controversial, but the one which is particular is approval of the leadership of civil society, approving the board, approving the management, and this is really a great challenge. We deployed representatives in the parliament to discuss and to show how it is shrinking civic space. We went on TV and radio, but at the end now the law was channeled to the president's office. So I think we need collective action. This is a global trend. if it is approved in Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere, I think our work will be undermined. So I think beyond what we are living in our countries, we need to build a network of protecting our space and our democracy, our liberty to express our views. I personally was on TV and saying, how could I criticize any institutions where I know that at any time they can deploy someone to come to they have the authority to come to do audit, and it's the organization who pay the fees. This is in the draft law.
Thank you. An even stronger example of not even subtle attempted control, but a regime where the leadership of CSOs must go through approval by the government. An even more extreme case. So we'll take these three, and then we do, in order to the second round, I'll ask just one person each to address perhaps the three questions. Obviously, the first one, I suppose, is for you, Nicholas, on the FARA. And yeah, please, again, short answers so that we can take more questions.
Grzegorz, I don't have a good answer for you. It's a bad law, it's a bad example, and it's outlived its utility. In fact, unfortunately, however, in the US, there's more attention and more application in recent years of the law than there was in prior years. And that's triggered by a lot of the concern around Russian influence in US politics. The only positive I have for you is that, strangely, in the US, a very litigious society, the Supreme Court has never ruled on the constitutionality of FARA. And we think, would be hard-pressed to survive that constitutional challenge were it to go to the Supreme Court under the First Amendment. So it is possible that law might not survive. You won't get that from the administration. It will just come down to some organization being found or forced to register and challenging it and it getting to the court. That's the best I can give you. Talk to me after and I can give you a lot more detail.
Thank you. Second question, lobbying versus advocacy, civil society and other interests, but also the OECD different standards and on lobbying, on protection of civic space. Carlotta, who would like to address that question? How do we reconcile the two?
No, I think that transparency of lobbying and regulating that, it's very important. So I think there's no doubt about that. I think here we are in a situation where actually the purpose of the law is not really to regulate lobbying, and then it's really focused on foreign funding and not looking at the overall issue about transparency of lobbying, especially also within the EU, and also the balance also between corporate interest and civil society concerns. So that's really a concern, and that's why most of the organizations say, yes, we would be in favor of a general, let's say, lobbying regulation, but not like this, which is more of a FARA or foreign agents law, in fact.
Thank you, Carlotta. And the other comment is really sharing of another country experience, but I think the message there, we need to do more, and we need more stronger partnership and coalitions to try and prevent that from happening. There were a few hands up here. There's still, yeah, please, 1 and 2. The mic is coming.
Okay, hello, I'm from the Association Watchdog Poland, and yeah, Grzegorz already told that we don't have this law. There were attempts twice, I believe, to put it. I just want to make short comment on what one of the strategy that it's in my opinion also worth taking. It's like I think we should, yeah, because it was said that this whole problem is not about transparency, actually. And apart as much as we know that it's all Putin's agenda, I would disagree a little bit because it is about transparency. When we trying to convince the general public if this law is good or bad, and this thing what I would like to say is that in my opinion, the NGOs and I'm beating my own breast now like as an NGO, but I think we lack transparency, and our financial reports, they are really not clear for the public. And even if organizations publish their reports, for ordinary people, it's like you can open it, the assets, liabilities. There is no clear list of incomes, of donations. So my thought is that we should really work hard on our credibility in a society, like trying to publish our reports in a more clear way, in the way that ordinary people can really see what are the source of money we have. And this is something that we in Watchdog Poland are really careful about, and we trying to make such list on our web pages and so on. But it's quite uncommon for other organizations. I read a lot of financial reports of other organizations. I have some knowledge about accountancy, but I couldn't find those information there.
Thank you. And the other question over there.
Thank you for this informative discussion. My name's Susan Coftry. I'm director of the Foreign Policy Centre, which is an international affairs think tank in the UK. I spent a lot of the last decade working on Russia and freedom of expression issues, and saw in real time the impact of the Foreign Agents Law on our partners and colleagues there. Now I'm working in the UK and seeing an entirely different problem, which is the use of British companies, PR agencies, private investigators and lobbying firms working on behalf of foreign governments or proxies who are actually, in some instances, targeting journalists with smear campaigns and surveillance and all of this. And in a recent workshop we had with some journalists, they were very supportive of FARA in the US and the developments of laws in the UK. So I'm just curious, maybe particularly for Nicholas, but anyone's answer, in terms of what are the alternatives that we could look at for tackling that side of the problem and shifting kind of the narrative discussion around that so it's clear, you know, what we're talking about in different contexts. Thank you.
Any other question? We can take three. Is there a hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm a youth-led board member at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I just wanted to mention one thing briefly about Georgia, because it's a very strange situation where we have, on the one hand, supposedly, quote-unquote, transparency law, but on the other hand, we have the law now being passed that allows money coming from the offshore zones to be freed from taxes and freed from obligations to be declared. So like private business money and profit money. So it's additional lands, I believe in. Eka might want to add on this, but my question is just, if the transparency is so much needed, why instead of asking only foreign-funded based CSOs to register, why instead of that ask every CSO to register and declare their funds and issue their financial reporting? Maybe that's the solution, like real solution to transparency, if that's the reason and point. Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple of questions touching on transparency. Is do we really need no more rules? Are we fully transparent? Or in fact there is something there? Who would like one? Was specifically about Georgia? I don't know if you want to take this one.
Yes. So again, I would say that we should look at the goal of those governments who are initiating these laws, right? So if the goal is really the transparency, then I don't think that anyone especially those who are working on very sensitive issues like investigation of the corruption in the government, they will be against this. So I can speak about the experience of Georgia, so especially those groups are extremely transparent in Georgia. And at the same time, again, we have other laws which regulate our activities. I would say that in Georgia there are around 10 laws according to which we operate. And definitely there are requirements to pay the taxes and to deal with the Ministry of Finance and Revenue Service and all that. And so, I mean, we were never against for the Revenue Service to, like, you know, publish, in addition to our reports, you know, publish whatever they have from our side. So that's not the problem. But I don't think that the requirement that we have in the law, for instance, from the moment the Ministry of Justice starts the monitoring of the CSO, they can approach into each and every individual who works for the organization to give out really sensitive and personal information about their sexual priorities, the political beliefs, and the religious beliefs, and all these kind of things. So, does it, you know, is it really about the transparency? To know for which party we voted during the last elections, or what are our sexual priorities? I don't think so. So, and by involving in these details, you know, and not looking at the bigger kind of the goal of the government, so we actually help these governments to, again, to persuade the public that this is what this public needs, like really to to close down all this, or to shut down all these NGOs who are, in fact, you know, they don't have this right religious or the political beliefs, and apparently working against the culture and the national interest of the country. So this is what I can say. And yes, I mean, again, so we also should look in package, like, you know, what was done by the government of Georgia, that there was this offshore law, you know, where they actually are creating the safe haven for the Russian oligarchs to bring all their assets in Georgia.
So there is clearly a differential treatment about transparency rule for some, not for others. But also, it's probably the balance is something that can't be solved, because it depends also on what the rules already are. And indeed, the requirement on civil society or any legal entity to disclose information varies as well, country by country. But I would like to give the floor to Janet. You want to address some of these points, please?
Yes, and it's I think the gentleman's contribution in terms of it's about transparency, and there is also issues that we have to address probably as civil society organizations in terms of being more transparent. And we were faced with this issue in the sub-regional, in our national facilitated processes through the regional process of the president of Mozambique, former president, like I've said, and the AFDB. And the question remained that, is there a mischief that we need a cure through legislation, a specific legislation? And we offered two proposals. One, it was get more time for consultations on the law so that we optimize on its benefits. The second thing is civil society. We were asking for self-regulation. We're saying we actually do want to be transparent, but we have an example, for example, of the Law Society of Zimbabwe as an example, and I think most law societies, they do the same, they self-regulate. We're like, is it possible that we can do a proof of concept and have a self-regulation? We have a National Association of NGOs. It could be that kind of a body. So we'll register as NGOs, set our own binding regulations for us to be part of those membership. Of course, one of the facilitators said, but that is not doesn't appeal much, that you don't want to be regulated. This will be the message to the president. Even when we then went to meet with the head of state, we had taken that off the table. But we still believe it's a conversation that we can also have, that it's not refusal to be transparent, But are there other ways?
And I think self-regulation is the norm in some other sectors, right? In the corporate and private sector is the norm. So why not exploring the same for civil society and therefore preventing without giving the excuse then to governments to pass laws on the excuse of transparency or better regulation. But I'm afraid that I was told that we should not go over time, and we have gone a couple of minutes over time. So I would like to thank all of you, first of all, for coming here, and all the people that attended again on the night of the second last day. So thank you very much. But it was a very rich and interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.